There's a moment that catches every empath completely off guard. Not the withdrawal, not the emotional unavailability, not the inconsistency or the breadcrumbs, or the slow erosion of your needs being treated as inconvenient. You've already lived through all of that. You've already absorbed it, interpreted it, made space for it, built your entire relational behavior around managing it. That part didn't catch you off guard because you were trained, by your own nature and by the dynamic itself, to expect it, accommodate it, find ways to keep loving through it. What catches you completely off guard is what happens when you stop. When you finally, after months or years of reaching and adjusting and hoping, reach the specific limit that your patience has been building toward the entire time. When you stop playing along. When you stop making yourself smaller and quieter and less demanding to keep the relationship functioning on terms that only ever worked for one of you. When you decide, not dramatically, not with an ultimatum, but with the quiet conviction of someone who has finally run out of a specific kind of patience, that's when the mask comes off. And what's underneath it is nothing like what you expected, because you expected that stopping the accommodation would reveal the wounded, defended, ultimately reachable person you've been trying to get to the whole time. The person underneath the avoidance patterns that you've been so patient with, so understanding of, so committed to seeing past the defense to reach. What's underneath the mask isn't that person. What's underneath is ugly, genuinely, specifically, shockingly ugly. And understanding why, understanding the precise psychological mechanism that produces the ugliness, what it reveals about who you were actually with, and what you're supposed to do with that revelation. This changes everything about how you understand what you survived and where you go from here. What the accommodation was actually doing. Before we talk about the ugliness, we need to understand what your playing along was providing. Because understanding what it was providing explains with complete precision why stopping it produces what it produces. Your accommodation wasn't just making the relationship more comfortable. It was performing a specific function in the avoidance psychological ecosystem that they couldn't perform themselves, and didn't have to perform as long as you were doing it for them. You were regulating them. Not obviously, not in ways either of you would have named while it was happening, but every time you softened your communication to avoid triggering their withdrawal, you were regulating their anxiety. Every time you suppressed a need because you could feel it would be too much for them, you were managing their emotional environment. Every time you forgave without requiring real accountability, you were maintaining the equilibrium their nervous system depended on. Every time you made yourself smaller to keep the peace, you were doing the emotional labor that kept their defensive system from having to engage with anything it didn't want to engage with. This is what empaths do in relationships with avoidance. Not because they're weak or codependent in a simple sense, because empaths are genuinely wired to feel what others feel, and feeling what the avoidant feels when they're anxious, when they're activated, when their defenses are threatened. The empathic response is to relieve that, to smooth it, to adjust the environment so the distress doesn't escalate. The empath regulates the avoidant the way a skilled parent regulates a dysregulated child, automatically, instinctively, often without conscious awareness that that's what they're doing. The avoidant, meanwhile, has organized their entire comfort in the relationship around this regulation. They don't know they're depending on it. They would deny they're depending on it. Their identity requires them to deny needing anything from anyone. But their functioning in the relationship is entirely contingent on you continuing to provide it, on you continuing to adjust, accommodate, absorb, smooth, manage. When you stop, they don't just lose your accommodation, they lose the regulation. And without external regulation, without you managing the emotional environment for them, they're left with their own unmanaged emotional responses to the situation. Responses they've never developed the capacity to handle. Responses their defensive system was never designed to process. And those unmanaged, unregulated, capacity-exceeding emotional responses are what the ugliness is made of. The mask and what it was hiding. The avoidance, calm detachment. The unbothered, low-maintenance, needs-nothing exterior that probably attracted you initially and confused you throughout was never who they actually were. It was a performance. Sustained, convincing, so consistent that it was easy to mistake for personality. But it was performance. Specifically the performance of someone who has learned that concealing emotional reactivity is safer than expressing it. Who has learned that appearing to need nothing is safer than acknowledging need. Who has learned that controlled distance is safer than the vulnerability of genuine closeness. The performance was sustainable as long as the relationship was functioning on their terms, as long as you were accommodating the dynamic they needed, as long as the unspoken arrangement, You manage your needs, they manage their comfort, everybody pretends this is a relationship. Remained intact. The performance didn't require much energy when the environment was calibrated to require nothing from them that they didn't want to give. But performance requires maintenance, and the maintenance requires a specific condition that nothing challenges the performance to the point where it can no longer be sustained. You stopping playing along is that challenge. When you stop accommodating, when you start requiring what you've always had the right to require, when you express needs that you've been suppressing, and enforce boundaries that you've been leaving unenforced, the performance meets something it wasn't designed to handle. Genuine relational pressure, the actual requirement to show up in ways the performance was designed to avoid showing up. And under that pressure, the performance collapses. What collapses with it is the image you had of who you were with. The person you thought was wounded but reachable. The person whose detachment was defense rather than character. The person who would eventually, with enough patience, reveal the connected, vulnerable, genuinely available human you believed was underneath. That person was the performance. And what's underneath the performance is the character. The one that emerges when the performance is no longer sustainable. The one you're about to meet. The specific ugliness. What it looks like and why it takes these forms. Let's be precise about what the ugliness actually looks like, because precision is what prepares you to recognize it as what it is rather than as something you need to respond to, manage, or try to understand into submission. The first form is cruelty designed to find the gaps in your armor. The avoidant has been in intimate proximity to you for months or years. They know your insecurities. They know the places where you doubt yourself, the wounds you've shared in vulnerable moments, the specific fears that live underneath your confidence. They've had access to this information throughout the relationship. While things were functioning on their terms, they didn't deploy this information as a weapon. The moment you stop playing along, they do. Suddenly, the comments are cutting in ways that are too precise to be accidental. The insecurity you mentioned once, quietly in a moment of trust, referenced with casual cruelty. The fear you shared about not being enough, confirmed with a tone that suggests they always agreed but were too polite to say so. The very openness that made you a good partner, your willingness to be honest about your struggles, becomes the ammunition for the punishment. This cruelty is shocking because it comes from someone who previously seemed too cool, too detached, too above emotional reactivity to behave this way. But the detachment was the performance. The cruelty is the character, and the specific targeting of your vulnerabilities reveals something important. They were paying attention the entire time. They knew exactly where you were soft. They just didn't need to use that knowledge while you were compliant. The second form is gaslighting, that is more aggressive and more comprehensive than anything you've experienced from them before. The avoidant has likely engaged in low-level gaslighting throughout the relationship, the subtle minimizing of your concerns, the gentle reframing of their behavior as your misperception. But when you stop playing along, the gaslighting escalates dramatically in both intensity and scope. Entire conversations are denied. Specific incidents you remember clearly are claimed never to have happened. The pattern of behavior you've been documenting in your own experience is rewritten as your imagination, your sensitivity, your tendency to misread neutral behavior as negative, and the history of the relationship itself gets reconstructed. Not just individual incidents, but the entire narrative recast, with you as the unreasonable, demanding, impossible to satisfy partner whose needs were always too much, and them as the reasonable, patient person who tried their best in the face of your escalating expectations. The gaslighting serves multiple simultaneous functions. It makes you doubt your own perception, which destabilizes the confidence that your boundaries require. It repositions them as victim rather than perpetrator, which generates sympathy from observers and deflects accountability. And it creates the possibility, if it works, that you'll doubt yourself enough to resume playing along, because playing along is what the relationship requires from your side to function. The third form is the triangulation, the sudden, visible, almost aggressively obvious pursuit of other people. The avoidant who couldn't commit to you, who needed endless space, who found your desire for consistency suffocating, is suddenly capable of enormous romantic energy directed towards someone new. The effort they never made for you, made visibly and publicly for someone else. The attention they rationed with you, given freely and enthusiastically elsewhere. The message is precise and intentional. I could have given you what you wanted, I just didn't want to give it to you. And the sub-message, delivered through the contrast between how they're pursuing the new person and how they treated you, is designed to do something specific to your self-concept, make you believe the problem was you. That your needs weren't actually too much, They just were too much for you specifically, for some reason specific to who you are, rather than to their patterns. This is the cruelest form of the ugliness, because it targets the deepest question. Not whether they treated you badly, that's established, but whether you were the reason, whether something about you specifically was what prevented the relationship from working. The triangulation is designed to plant that question and let it grow. The fourth form is the smear campaign, the reconstruction of the relationship's history for external consumption, in ways that position them as victim and you as villain. Mutual friends receive a version of events that bears only passing resemblance to what actually happened. The narrative has been carefully constructed to be superficially plausible, enough truth woven into the fiction that people who weren't there can't easily dismiss it, while being fundamentally false in its characterization of who you were and what you did. The smear campaign serves the avoidant's need to control the narrative, to ensure that the story of why the relationship ended is one in which they emerge sympathetically, rather than accountably. And it serves to isolate you, to damage the support systems you might turn to in your healing, to preemptively discredit you as a narrator of your own experience, to ensure that anyone you talk to has already heard a version of events that makes your account seem like defensive self-justification. Why the ugliness takes you by surprise every time. Here's what's important to understand about why the ugliness is shocking, even for empaths who intellectually understand avoidant psychology. You weren't wrong about the wounded person underneath. You weren't imagining the glimpses of vulnerability that kept you hopeful. You weren't projecting depth onto someone who was entirely shallow. The wounded person is real. The capacity for genuine connection that you sensed was real. The moments when the defense came down and something true passed between you, those were real. You weren't inventing them. What you were wrong about, what the ugliness is correcting, is the relationship between the wounded person and the character. You believed, because empaths tend to believe this, that the wounded person was the real person and the defended, unavailable pattern-driven behavior was just the protection around the real person. That if you could get past the protection, you'd find the real person waiting there, capable of receiving your love and offering equivalent love in return. The ugliness reveals the more complicated truth. The wounded person and the ugly character are not in opposition. They're the same person. The wounds created the character. The early experiences that produced the attachment wounds also produced the entitlement, the inability to tolerate consequences, the explosive reactivity when control is lost, the willingness to weaponize intimacy when it becomes a tool of punishment. The wounded child and the ugly adult are continuous. The vulnerability and the cruelty come from the same source. This is what the empath couldn't see from inside the hope, and it's what the ugliness makes undeniable. What the ugliness is actually revealing. The ugly behavior is not a departure from who the avoidant is. It's the most accurate information you've ever received about who they are. This matters profoundly, because the natural empath response to the ugliness is to contextualize it, to say this isn't who they really are, this is their pain speaking, this is their trauma responding. And while that framing contains some psychological truth, it functions as a way of protecting the avoidant from the implications of their behavior, of excusing the inexcusable because the excuses are technically available. The ugliness is who they are when they're not getting what they want, when they're not in control. When someone stops accommodating the dynamic they've built around maintaining their comfort at the expense of your needs. And who someone is when they're not getting what they want is the most honest version of who they are available. The version with the least performance, the least incentive to manage impression, the least reason to conceal what's actually there. What the ugliness reveals specifically is entitlement of a depth that the relationship's functioning was hiding. The avoidant believed, at a level beneath conscious articulation, that they were entitled to your patience, entitled to your emotional labor, entitled to relationship on their terms without reciprocity. Not because they were consciously calculating this entitlement, but because the dynamic was confirming it so consistently that it became their operating assumption. The empath will adjust. The empath will accommodate. The empath's needs will flex to fit whatever space the avoidant is willing to make. When you stop accommodating, what they experience isn't disappointment, it's outrage. The specific outrage of someone whose entitlement has been violated. Someone who believed they had a right to what they've been receiving and is now furious that the right is being revoked. The ugliness is the expression of that outrage, and the intensity of the outrage reveals how absolute the entitlement was, how completely they'd built their expectation of your endless accommodation into their model of how the relationship was supposed to function. The ugliness also reveals the absence of genuine respect that the relationship was masking. Respect involves honoring someone's needs as real, treating their limits as legitimate, caring about their well-being in ways that show up in behavior, not just in words. The avoidance response to your limits, the cruelty, the gaslighting, the punishment for enforcing what you've had the right to enforce the entire time, is the clearest possible evidence that genuine respect was never present. You were respected instrumentally, respected as long as you were functioning in the role the relationship required from you. The moment you stopped functioning in that role, the respect evaporated completely, revealing that what looked like respect was actually just satisfaction with your compliance. The triggers, what makes the ugliness emerge most intensely. The ugliness isn't constant, it spikes at specific moments. Understanding those moments helps you recognize them as the predictable operation of a psychological pattern rather than as evidence of anything about you. The ugliness peaks when you state a boundary with clarity and without apology. Not a request, not a suggestion. A boundary, clear, specific, stated in a tone that communicates you mean it. The avoidant has been managing your limits throughout the relationship by treating them as negotiable. Your expressions of discomfort as starting points for negotiation. Your statements of what you need as the opening position in a process that ends with you accepting less. A clearly stated, firmly held boundary that isn't opening for negotiation disrupts this entire mechanism. And the disruption produces the ugliness, specifically the ugliness designed to make maintaining the boundary feel so costly that you abandon it and resume negotiating. The ugliness also peaks when you stop managing their emotional state for them, when you express your own feelings without filtering them through consideration of how the avoidant will receive them, when you stop adjusting your emotional expression to maintain their comfort and simply feel what you feel, say what you think, need what you need, without the elaborate pre-censorship that has been your contribution to the relationship's stability. The avoidant, who has been having their emotional environment managed by you, suddenly has to manage their own responses to someone else's authentic emotional expression, and they can't. The ugliness is the tantrum of someone who has never developed that capacity because they've never needed to develop it, because you were always doing it for them. The ugliness is at its most intense when you actually leave, when the boundary stops being a statement and becomes an action, when you remove yourself from the situation with the specific completeness that communicates this isn't a threat but a decision. The avoidant has been dismissing your expressions of limit throughout the relationship by treating them as emotional weather, temporary, manageable, something to wait out until you return to baseline. Your actual departure, with the conviction that distinguishes it from all the previous almost departures, removes every mechanism they'd been using to manage the situation. No more waiting it out. No more dismissing the limit as temporary. No more assuming you'll come back to baseline because this is the baseline. The panic this produces is the source of the ugliness at its most extreme. They cycle rapidly, begging, then threatening, then appealing to guilt, then making promises, then turning cruel when none of it works. The cycle is the avoidant trying every manipulation in sequence and discovering that none of them are finding purchase. And the ugliness of the cruelty that comes when nothing else works is the ugliness of someone who has lost all control over a situation they believed they could always manage. And finally, the ugliness peaks when they see you thriving. When you're not diminished, when you're not struggling in the ways that would confirm their importance to you, when you're visibly, genuinely, undeniably doing well, investing in your life, present in your own existence, clearly not waiting for anything they might eventually offer. Your wellness, in their absence, is the most threatening thing available to the avoidant's ego, because the ego requires you to be worse off without them, requires your life to be diminished by their absence, requires some evidence that you needed them. Your thriving is evidence to the contrary, and the ugliness it produces is the rage of someone whose ego is being denied the confirmation it needs to maintain the story it's been telling about itself. Why the empath's instinctive response makes everything worse. Here's where we need to be honest about something that's uncomfortable but important. The empath's natural response to the ugliness, the response that your wiring makes almost automatic, is precisely the response that doesn't serve you and doesn't change anything. Your instinct when the ugliness arrives is to understand it, to contextualize it within their wounds, their history, their patterns, to see the hurt person behind the hurtful behavior, to extend the same empathy to their ugly behavior that you extended to their defended behavior throughout the relationship, to think they're in pain when what's actually happening is they're punishing me for having needs. This response is not weakness. It's not stupidity. It's your genuine gift operating in a context where it's being weaponized against you. Your empathy is what made you stay as long as you stayed. Your empathy is what made you try as hard as you tried. And your empathy is what the ugliness is now trying to exploit, trying to get you to extend understanding to behavior that has forfeited the right to your understanding, trying to get you to see the pain behind the cruelty and respond to the pain while absorbing the cruelty. Don't. Not because empathy is wrong, because what the ugliness requires is not empathy. It requires consequence. And consequence is something the empath's instinct actively resists providing, because consequence involves allowing someone to experience pain, even pain they've earned. And that conflicts with the empath's deepest wiring. The empath's other instinctive response is to defend, to counter the false narrative, to explain to mutual friends what actually happened, to correct the gaslighting with evidence, to ensure that the record reflects reality rather than the avoidant's reconstructed version of it. This response is understandable. You want to be understood, want the truth to be visible, want the lies to be corrected. But every defense is engagement, and every engagement gives the avoidant what they're actually seeking through the ugliness: continued access to you, continued ability to produce reactions in you, continued evidence that they can still reach you, still affect you, still generate response from you, even if the response is argument rather than accommodation. Your defense doesn't correct the situation. It confirms that the ugliness is working. What the ugliness is actually giving you. I want to reframe something completely. Because the ugliness, which is painful, which is shocking, which is genuinely difficult to witness from someone you cared about, is also the most clarifying thing the relationship has ever produced. It's burning the bridge you needed burned. Here's what I mean. Before the ugliness, there was always the possibility of going back. Not because you should have, not because it would have ended differently, but because the avoidance defended, unavailable, inconsistent self was ambiguous enough that love could still maintain the hope. The wounded person you could see underneath was real enough that imagination could still build a future around the person they might become. The relationship's potential existed in the gap between who they were and who you believed they could be. And as long as that gap existed, going back was a psychological possibility even when it was practically unwise. The ugliness closes the gap, completely, irreversibly. The person they're being when the mask comes off is incompatible with the future you were imagining in ways that cannot be reinterpreted into compatibility. You cannot build a future with someone who weaponizes your vulnerabilities. Cannot love someone back to health who responds to your needs with punitive cruelty. Cannot maintain hope for someone who shows you with the specific clarity of their ugliness that the wounded person you were trying to reach would respond to being reached by hurting you. The ugliness is the answer to the question you've been asking the entire relationship. Who is this person actually? And the answer, while devastating, is the most valuable thing the relationship has given you. Because you can make real decisions with real information. You couldn't always make real decisions with the ambiguous information the relationship was providing while the performance was intact. The ugliness also eliminates the guilt that empaths carry when they leave. The guilt of having limits. The guilt of not being infinitely patient. The guilt of choosing yourself when someone else is clearly in pain. Empaths carry this guilt heavily. It's part of the price of the wiring. But you cannot feel guilty for having boundaries when the person who violated those boundaries responds with punishment. You cannot feel responsible for someone's pain when the pain is the direct result of you refusing to continue absorbing their patterns. The ugliness is permission. Permission to leave completely, to stop feeling responsible for their well-being, to recognize that your accommodation was never going to produce the outcome you were hoping for because the person you were accommodating was always capable of this. The only response that works. Complete non-engagement. Not selective non-engagement, where you don't respond to the cruel messages but you defend yourself to mutual friends. Not partial non-engagement, where you maintain one channel of communication for practical matters that becomes the avenue for continued manipulation. Complete, comprehensive, without exception. This means not responding to the cruelty, not to call it out, not to defend yourself, not to explain why it's wrong. Silence. The silence isn't acceptance of the ugliness, it's removal of the thing the ugliness needs to function, which is your engagement. It means not engaging with the false narrative, not correcting the lies, not defending your character to mutual friends, not trying to ensure the record reflects reality. One clear statement of the truth to close people whose opinion matters to you, and then silence. Let the narrative exist. People who believe it without checking with you first aren't people whose understanding of you is reliable enough to require defending. It means removing every channel of access. blocking on every platform, through every mutual contact, in every context where the ugliness can reach you. Not because you're afraid of them, because continued access is continued opportunity for harm, and you're done being in harm's way. And it means redirecting every bit of energy that would have gone into processing their ugliness, into processing your own healing. The ugliness is information you've received. You've processed the information. This person is not safe, is not capable of respecting your limits, is not someone the relationship should continue with. Once the information is processed, continuing to focus on their behavior is giving them real estate in your mind and your emotional life that they've forfeited the right to occupy. Your healing is not about them. It never was. It was always about you. About understanding what in your history made this dynamic feel familiar enough to sustain. About developing the specific self-knowledge that protects you from the same pattern in future connections. About reclaiming the parts of yourself that the accommodation required you to suppress. What the empath learns that no other experience could teach. Here's the permanent thing this experience produces. The thing that exists on the other side of the ugliness when you've fully moved through it rather than around it. You learn where your empathy belongs and where it doesn't. Your empathy is not infinitely available to every person who presents a wound. Your empathy is a resource, significant, valuable, finite in the specific sense that offering it to people who exploit it means it isn't available for people who deserve it. The avoidant taught you this through the ugliness in a way that theoretical understanding never could. You can know intellectually that your empathy should be protected. You don't fully know it, in the bone-deep way that changes behavior, until you've watched someone take your empathy and use it as a weapon against you. You learn the difference between understanding someone and accepting mistreatment from them. These got conflated in the relationship. Your understanding of the avoidance wounds became the reason you accepted behavior that wounded understanding cannot excuse. The ugliness makes the distinction undeniable. You can understand completely why someone acts the way they act, can trace the wound, follow the pattern, feel genuine compassion for the pain that produced the behavior, and still remove yourself from the path of the behavior. Understanding explains. It doesn't obligate you to absorb. And you learn, this one is perhaps the most important, to recognize the pattern earlier, not because you become suspicious or guarded or closed, but because you've seen the full arc of this specific dynamic from the inside. The beginning of it, which felt like depth and intensity, and the specific electricity of being with someone who seems to be operating beneath the surface. The middle of it, which felt like work you were willing to do because the potential seemed worth the effort. The end of it, which produced the ugliness that burned away every remaining ambiguity. You've seen all of it, and having seen all of it means you'll recognize the beginning of it in future connections with a speed and accuracy that would have been impossible before this experience. The ugliness was the education you needed and didn't know you needed. It was the relationship finally telling you the truth. And truth, even when it arrives through cruelty, even when it's delivered through behavior that no one should have to absorb, even when it costs you something real to receive, truth is always where the real work of becoming who you're meant to be actually begins. The avoidant acted ugly when you stopped playing along, and the ugliness told you everything. Now you know. And knowing, really knowing, in the specific way that experience rather than information produces knowing, means you never have to learn this particular lesson again. The playing along is over, and so is the pretending that it ever served you. But I want to stay with that phrase, it ever served you, because I think there's a more honest and more complete version of that sentence that needs to be said before we close this chapter entirely. Because the playing along did serve you, in a specific, limited, ultimately insufficient way, it served you. And acknowledging that is not the same as saying it was right to continue indefinitely. It's saying that you weren't stupid or naive or lacking in self-awareness when you did it. You were doing something that made sense within the framework you were operating from at the time. And understanding why it made sense then, and why it no longer makes sense now, is the difference between leaving this experience with genuine self-knowledge and leaving it with a story about yourself as someone who was fooled. You weren't fooled. You were operating from your deepest nature in a situation that exploited that nature. Those are different things, and the distinction matters for how you carry this experience forward. What the playing along was actually about. Empaths don't play along with dysfunction because they lack self-respect. They play along because of something much more fundamental to who they are. They can feel the other person's pain, not metaphorically. Actually, the avoidance wound, the original childhood wound that produced the defensive patterns, the emotional unavailability, the need for excessive space, An empath can feel that wound with a clarity and a specificity that most people simply don't have access to. And when you can feel someone's wound that clearly, when you can sense the frightened child underneath the defended adult with the kind of precision that your sensitivity provides, leaving feels like abandonment, not just of them, of the version of them that needs what only your particular quality of presence can provide. Your playing along was, in its deepest structure, your empathy responding to perceived suffering with the instinct that has defined your entire relational life. Stay, understand, create safety, make space for the healing that your presence might enable. This instinct is not pathological. In the right context, with the right person, in a relationship where the care is genuinely mutual and the other person is actively working on themselves, this quality of yours is one of the most extraordinary things a human being can bring to a relationship. The capacity to feel another person's wound and love toward them anyway, to see past defense to the person underneath, to maintain patience in the face of patterns that would drive most people away. This is rare. It's valuable. It has produced real healing in people who are capable of receiving it. The avoidant was not capable of receiving it, not because they were beyond help in some permanent sense, but because receiving genuine empathic presence requires a level of vulnerability that their entire psychological structure is organized around preventing. Your empathy was trying to reach through walls that were built precisely to prevent being reached. And the reaching, however skilled, however patient, however genuinely offered, kept the dynamic functioning in ways that benefited the avoidant, while preventing them from experiencing the consequences that might have eventually motivated genuine change. The playing along served you by allowing you to remain consistent with your own deepest values. Empaths value loyalty. Empaths value not abandoning people in their pain. Empaths value the long view, the belief that sustained presence and patience can produce outcomes that impatience forecloses. The playing along allowed you to be, in your own eyes, the person you want to be, the person who doesn't give up, the person who sees the best in others and holds space for it, the person who loves deeply enough to stay through difficulty. What it cost you was the relationship with yourself that requires you to be seen and met and held in the specific way that genuine partnership provides. You are so busy seeing and meeting and holding the avoidant that there was no equivalent energy available for your own being seen and met and held. And that deficit, the accumulated cost of the playing along, is what finally produced the limit that the accommodation was always building toward. The moment the limit arrived, and what it actually was. Most empaths describe reaching their limit as a sudden thing, a final straw, a specific moment when something broke and the playing along simply wasn't possible anymore. And while there's usually a specific moment that crystallizes the decision, the truth is more gradual than that. The limit wasn't reached in the moment it felt like it was reached. It was reached over months or years of small accumulations, each one individually manageable, each one individually forgiven and moved past, until they weren't, until the accumulation became something that a specific moment revealed rather than created. This matters because empaths often feel guilty about their limit, feel like they should have left sooner, should have enforced boundaries earlier, should have stopped playing along before the cost became what it became. The guilt assumes that the limit arriving when it did was a failure of some kind, of self-awareness, of self-respect, of the capacity to see clearly what was happening. But the limit arriving when it did was not failure. It was the specific, appropriate, hard-earned response of someone who had genuinely tried, who had given the relationship and the person in it every reasonable opportunity to become what was needed, who had extended patience past the point where most people would have stopped extending it, not out of weakness, but out of the genuine belief that the person and the relationship were worth the investment. When the limit finally arrived, when the playing along became impossible not because you decided to stop, but because you simply couldn't continue, that wasn't weakness. That was your self-preservation instinct finally breaking through the empathic override that had been suppressing it. Your system finally asserting that the cost had exceeded what love alone could justify continuing to pay. The ugliness that followed is the avoidance response to that assertion. Their response to you finally, for the first time in the relationship, putting your own needs on equal footing with theirs. And the specific quality of the ugliness, its cruelty, its precision, its apparent intention to make you pay for having needs, is the clearest possible evidence that equal footing was never something the dynamic was designed to accommodate. What you carry forward and what you leave behind, here's the specific inventory that matters now. Not the inventory of what the relationship cost. You know that already. The inventory of what it produced that belongs to you permanently, regardless of everything else. You carry forward the knowledge of your own limit, not the theoretical limit you would have described before this experience, not the limit you believed you had based on who you thought you were, the actual limit, the real one, the one that was tested at the edge and held. Knowing your actual limit, having lived past your theoretical limit to discover where the real one lives, is self-knowledge that no amount of self-reflection produces without the specific pressure of actual experience. You know now, in your body, where your yes ends and your no begins. That knowledge will serve you in every relationship you navigate for the rest of your life. You carry forward the specific pattern recognition that this dynamic developed. The ability to read the early signatures of avoidant attachment with an accuracy you didn't have before. The quality of emotional unavailability that presents as depth. The specific texture of someone who is performing connection without offering it. The way breadcrumbing feels different from genuine inconsistency in someone who is trying. The distinction between someone who needs time and space as part of genuine relating and someone who uses time and space as a system for avoiding genuine relating. These distinctions are now available to you at a sensory level, not just intellectual understanding, but felt recognition that operates earlier and more accurately than it did before. You carry forward the understanding that your empathy requires discernment to be the gift it's meant to be, not less empathy, discernment about where the empathy goes. The empath who has been through this dynamic and learned from it doesn't become less empathic on the other side. They become more precise about which wounds they're positioned to help heal and which wounds require professional support that intimate relationship cannot provide. The avoidance wound, real as it is, profound as it is, required more than your empathy could provide. Recognizing that is not abandoning the wounded, it's acknowledging the limits of what love alone, however extraordinary, can reach. What you leave behind is the belief that your loving someone well enough can overcome their unwillingness to do their own work. This belief, which is one of the most beautiful and most dangerous beliefs available to an empath, served its purpose. It kept you trying when trying was still reasonable, and it cost you significantly when it kept you trying past the point where trying was serving anyone well. Leave it behind not because love isn't powerful, but because love's power has specific limits that this experience has now defined for you with unusual precision. Leave behind the guilt of the limit. The guilt that you should have left sooner, tried differently, been more or less of whatever might have produced a different outcome. The outcome was determined by the avoidance capacity and their choices, not by your performance as a partner. You brought what you brought. It was extraordinary. It wasn't received in the way extraordinary things deserve to be received. And that failure of reception was never about you. Leave behind the story that the ugliness was caused by your stopping playing along. The ugliness was not caused by your boundaries. Your boundaries revealed the ugliness that was always present, always underneath, always the response that your accommodation was preventing from being visible. You didn't create the ugliness. You just stopped hiding it from yourself. And stopping hiding it from yourself, however painful the revelation, is one of the most important things you've ever done for the truth of your own life. The relationship that comes after this one, it's worth saying something specific and concrete about what comes after. Because this experience will inevitably shape how you enter the next connection, and shaping it consciously is better than letting it shape you unconsciously. The first thing that will be different is your speed of recognition. You will see the early signatures of unavailability faster than you saw them before. The question is what you do with what you see. The risk, the specific risk that this experience creates, is that recognition becomes a reason for preemptive withdrawal from connections that are ambiguous, rather than genuinely unavailable. That the pattern recognition, which is a gift, becomes a defense that keeps you from engaging with people who have complexity without having unavailability. Complexity is not unavailability. Difficulty is not avoidance. Private is not defended. The discernment you've developed is meant to help you distinguish between these things more accurately, not to collapse them all into the same category and withdraw from anyone who presents any similarity to the pattern you've learned. The second thing that will be different is your relationship to your own needs within the connection. Having suppressed your needs for so long, having learned the specific discipline of managing your needs to fit the space the avoidant was willing to make, you may initially struggle to express needs clearly in a new connection, even when the new person has the capacity to meet them. The suppression became habit. The habit will try to reassert itself in new contexts where it isn't necessary. Watch for this. The moment you notice yourself pre-censoring a need because you're anticipating that it will be too much, pause. Ask whether the anticipation is based on evidence from the current person or on memory from the previous dynamic. Then express the need, clearly, without the elaborate softening that the previous relationship required. And observe what the new person does with it. Someone with genuine capacity for partnership will receive your expressed need as information rather than as threat, will engage with it rather than defend against it, will either meet it or have an honest conversation about how they can or can't meet it, rather than simply withdrawing in the face of it. That response, engaging with your need rather than defending against it, is what genuine availability feels like. It will feel different from what you're used to, different in a way that might initially seem almost too simple. Trust the simplicity. The previous dynamic was complicated because unavailability requires management. Availability doesn't require management, it just requires showing up. And showing up consistently, honestly, without the elaborate performance of unavailability is exactly what you deserve. You've been through something that cost you real things: time, energy, self-doubt, the specific grief of loving someone who couldn't receive your love in the ways love deserves to be received. Those costs were real. They happened. They're part of your history now in ways that can't be undone. But so is everything you developed through paying them. The playing along is over. The ugliness has revealed what it was always going to reveal. The lesson has been received in the specific, visceral, body-level way that only experience delivers. And you, having finally stopped playing along, having finally seen what stopping revealed, having finally received the information that the ugliness was carrying, you are more fully yourself than you were when the playing along began. That self is what moves forward now, clearer, more precise, more discerning about where your extraordinary empathy belongs, and completely done pretending that accommodation is the same thing as love. It never was. Now you know that, and knowing it changes everything about what comes next.